What is China planning for its future lunar missions? We're in October 2022. The IAC in Paris has just passed with lots of great nuggets of information on this very topic. So let's do a late 2022 Chinese space exploration update focusing on lunar exploration, as we'll cover deep space exploration in another episode. Let's get started. This video is sponsored by Masterworks. More on them later. China's lunar exploration missions, as you probably already know, are called the Chang'e missions, and there have been 5 since 2007, the Chang'e 1 to 5. These missions had an increasing level of complexity. The first 2 were orbiter missions enabling a mapping of the moon, the 2 following ones put landers and rovers on the lunar surface, and the last mission, the Chang'e 5, was wrapped up early last year and brought back roughly 1.7 kilograms of lunar samples. So what comes next is where things get interesting. China has 3 more major lunar missions scheduled for this decade. There's the Chang'e 6 mission scheduled for launch on a Long March 5 in 2024, and this mission is based on the same architecture as the Chang'e 5, meaning that it will be composed of an orbiter, a lander, an ascent vehicle, and a return capsule. And its main objective will also be to bring samples back. Now, the major difference this time is that Chang'e 6 is aiming for the far side of the moon in the South Pole Aitken Basin, an area that's of interest due to the presence of ice in the more southern areas. Following this, there will be the Chang'e 7 and 8 missions, which will launch respectively in 2026 and 2030. These 2 missions will have one essential technology objective, which is in situ resources utilization, which means using local resources such as lunar regolith and lunar ice to produce useful elements like water, oxygen, and potentially building material, rather than importing all of that from the Earth. Chang'e 7 will be composed of an orbiter, a lander, a rover, and a hopper, and this hopper part is something that's new compared to previous missions. This hopper will be a sort of small drone that will be able to perform hops and explore craters in the vicinity of the lander, which would otherwise have been inaccessible. This could be comparable to what the US-based firm Intuitive Machines is doing with NASA within the context of NASA's CLPS program. It's unclear today how China's hopper will be powered, but it's probably going to be thrusters as there is no atmosphere on the moon. Regarding landing location, the Chang'e 7 will land somewhere beyond a latitude of 85 degrees south, close to the South Pole. We don't really know the exact landing site, but a Chinese paper in 2020 actually gave away 10 potential candidates, and which is especially interesting when you put it on top of NASA candidate landing sites for the Artemis program, because there are potential overlaps. The landing site will have little to no direct line of sight with the Earth, so the Chinese will be launching 2 years prior the Chang'e-2 relay satellite in lunar orbit, and this satellite will act as an in-between relay satellite for communications. There will also be a little bit of international cooperation. We know, for example, from a couple of weeks ago that the Chinese signed an agreement with the UAE to have the Chang'e 7 carry a 10-kilogram mini rover called the Rashid 2, and China has also been seeking to carry other foreign payloads. And finally, the concluding mission is called the Chang'e 8, and the Chang'e 8 will have similar components to the Chang'e 7 with an orbiter, a lander, a rover, and a hopper. And beyond ISRU experiments, we know that the Chang'e 8 mission is also supposed to set up a sort of prototype base with the establishment of a command center and a communication base station. Now, we don't have confirmed specifics yet on what this will look like, but there have been hints in previous presentations. Typically in April 2022, Wu Yanhua mentioned that China would be demonstrating a lunar relay constellation, with the first launches being in 2023 and 2024, and that this constellation would apparently provide communications, but also navigation services, acting as a sort of lunar GPS, if you will. And in March 2022, so 1 month prior, Wu Weiren discussed the possibility of establishing a so-called lunar Wi-Fi network, quote unquote, similar to what NASA has been exploring in parallel. Regarding the ISRU experiments, it's still unclear which ones will be attempted in the upcoming Chang'e missions. For the production of oxygen, for example, a question could be, should the ice of the South Pole be harvested? And this may seem like a logical solution, but the ice is situated in craters which could be very hard to reach and exploit. And maybe a better solution would be extracting the oxygen from the metal oxides in lunar regolith, something that potentially seems more accessible, but that could also be more power intensive. And so there are a lot of pros and cons. It's still an open question as to which is the best solution, and China and other space powers have been looking very closely at these various solutions, and we've seen many proposals in conferences such as this Chinese experiment shown at the Deep Space Exploration Forum in Shenzhen last year, which would have one of the upcoming Chang'e landers produce oxygen by sort of heating up the ferrous oxides present in lunar regolith. Now, all of this is meant to prepare China for its first crewed lunar mission scheduled for before 2030, as well as the future Chinese lunar base, the ILRS, which stands for the International Lunar Research Station. Now, before we get into that, I just want to add that this represents a very significant investment for China. Space exploration is not cheap, and this is why nations tend to partner together, such as through the US-led Artemis program. And this is especially important today as few governments have currently room for extra spending. The Chinese economy, for example, is anticipating record low growth this year, and for the US, many economists are expecting a recession in 2023. And it's why institutions like Goldman Sachs are quietly investing 30 to 50% of their portfolios in uncorrelated assets that perform well during downturns, such as the ones on offer from today's sponsor, Masterworks. Contemporary art is a fascinating asset. It has this very unique feature of not being correlated with stocks and bonds, and it doesn't have the associated volatility. Unfortunately, until recently, investing in art by top artists like the Picassos, the Banksys, and the Monets, this was accessible only to the super wealthy. But this is where what Masterworks is doing gets really interesting, because they've been democratizing investing in art, basically enabling anybody to buy shares in high-value works of art. Now, bear in mind that as with all investments, value can go up and down, so this does not really constitute financial advice. But historical data has consistently shown the very solid financial performance of art, and one study in particular has highlighted that contemporary art prices has outperformed the S&P 500 total returns by 164% over the past 26 years. So if you're interested in exploring investing in fine art, there's a link in the description below for priority access to Masterworks platform. Thank you, Masterworks, for sponsoring this video. And with that, back to Chinese lunar missions. In parallel to the Chang'e missions, China is preparing two major lunar projects. The first one is to land a Chinese astronaut on the moon by 2030, and then there's the longer-term ILRS lunar station. And this date of before the 2030s for the first crewed lunar landing has been mentioned by several high-level members of China's space program leadership, such as Long Lehao or Chang'e. And this date doesn't seem too far-fetched considering that a big part of the required technology building blocks have already been obtained. The crewed spacecraft, for example, is already developed. It's the NGCS, the Next Generation Crewed Spacecraft, or 新一代载人飞船 in Chinese, and which is a sort of Chinese equivalent of the Orion spacecraft, which performed an on-orbit test in 2020. The rocket is the Long March 5G, also known as the Long March 5DY, which exists in a three-stage version capable of putting 27 tons in translunar injection. And while this rocket doesn't exist today, it's still under development. It's based on engines that basically already exist. And so those are the YF-100K and the YF-100M, which are modified and improved versions of the existing YF-100 used by the Long March rockets today. The maiden launch is scheduled to take place in 2026, according to presentations by the chief designer of the Long March rockets, Long Lehao. Now, what's missing, on the other hand, is the lander and the ascent vehicle. And while there's no official existence of such a development, there have been clues over the past 5 years that the Chinese are working on this. In April 2018, for example, the chief designer of the crewed spaceflight program, Zhou Jianping, launched a request for proposals for a lunar lander and an ascent vehicle. And in August 2021, in what could have been a slip, the School of Aerospace Engineering of Xiamen University referred to one of its high-level visitors from China's largest spacecraft manufacturer, CAST, as Li Yan, the deputy chief commander of the lander module of the crewed lunar spacecraft program, suggesting that the development of such a spacecraft naturally is well underway. The way this first crewed mission would take place is with two Long March 5Gs. One would be carrying the lander and the ascent vehicle, while the other would be carrying the NGCS with 3 astronauts. Both would make their way independently to the moon before docking in lunar orbit. And at this point, 2 astronauts out of 3 would get into the lander and land for seemingly a short period before returning to the orbiting NGCS, thanks to the ascent vehicle. The NGCS would then return to an Earth-Moon transfer trajectory, and the return capsule would then perform a controlled atmospheric reentry over China. And I think, interestingly, this puts a bit of pressure on the first crewed lunar landing of the Artemis program, now scheduled for 2025, because 2025 is still several years ahead of the Chinese, but it doesn't give Artemis that much wiggle room for any delays, if getting there first is a concern for anybody. So once China completes all of these Chang'e missions and the first crewed lunar landing, this takes them to the so-called construction phase of the ILRS lunar station program. This project is somewhat the equivalent of the Artemis program, and in theory, it's China and Russia-led, but open to international partners. So far, no country has joined since the official announcement of the program in June 2021, but we know that China notably is actively looking for new members. There have been rumors of countries like France, Italy, Thailand, or Saudi Arabia being interested, but it's quite possible that the Russian involvement in the program has been putting off some space agencies due to everything that's going on in Ukraine. And this is probably why the Chinese seem to, present the ILRS as a China-only project at IAC rather than Sino-Russian. Regarding the ILRS construction phase, the Chinese have tentatively announced 5 missions. You have the ILRS-1, which would establish a command center with basic energy and communication infrastructure to enable autonomous operations. And this would be things like presumably relay satellites and solar power stations. A second mission, the ILRS-2, would focus on building the necessary infrastructure for moon-based sciences, including geology, sample collection, and other fun stuff like that. The ILRS-3 mission would be specifically dedicated to in situ resources utilization facilities, while the ILRS-4 would explore and verify technologies to be used for the future phases of the ILRS, so it's things like biology experiments and sample collection and return infrastructure. And finally, you have the ILRS-5, the last mission, which would build moon-based astronomy infrastructure and Earth observation systems. And we know this is something that the Chinese have been quite keen about since the moon has almost no interference from any radio wave activity from the Earth. Now, as you can imagine, the ILRS is a huge endeavor that's still very early stage, so all of this will inevitably experience changes as we approach the 2030s. Nothing from a technology standpoint is really confirmed apart from the Super Heavy Long March 9 rocket, which we know for a fact is under development, although the final rocket architecture is not confirmed. China is also currently working on some rather futuristic tech, such as space-based solar power stations, which could be extremely useful for lunar missions, and which we discussed in a separate episode. And so that's for the late 2022 China lunar exploration update. We'll of course do a separate episode on deep space exploration. Last point also before signing off, keep an eye out for the Mengtian Space Lab launch livestream that I'll be holding at the end of the month if you're interested. As always, thank you very much for watching. A special thanks to our Patreon supporters. And with that, I'll see you next time.